starting to talk about the darker shade of magic, especially when you've got Vicious being a much more contemporary story with supernatural sort of unveilings, whereas this one's more steampunk, more gritty. I kind of got, especially with Kel's Cloak, I got very much sort of like a Doctor Who wibbly wobbly time traveling. You know, all is not what it seems, like something that's quite innocent, like a phone box or like a coat, you know, has so many more dimensions than you think. But what was it like introducing a darker shade of magic, but a different type of magic with the Antari?
Yeah. Well, so most of my magical systems, and like Vicious is a magical system. It's a playing with science. So I guess it often gets shelved in science fiction because it's playing with medical science. But my magical systems, whatever they are, I try to make them really grounded and really natural and nature based. And so in Vicious, we are dealing with like that threshold between life and death, but also what's been documented in our own world in terms of like adrenal responses and how they can give you this kind of temporary state of superhuman ability. All I did was take it one step further to like a permanent state. In A Darker Shade of Magic, it's really like a love letter to like Avatar: The Last Airbender and Metal Alchemist. Like I wanted to take my magical system and make it really grounded. So it's an elemental grounding. Everything kind of comes back to these elements that they're able to manipulate. It's just that my Antari magicians, these really rare magicians, can also use blood magic, which is just takes them up to the nth degree of power. I love it. I love building magical systems because I wasn't a huge reader growing up. I felt really alienated by a lot of fantasy specifically because it felt like you almost had to like prove that you were a good enough fan. I felt like, especially growing up with like Lord of the Rings, like you had to like learn a fictional language and you had to like prove that you knew everything, and you didn't just read Lord of the Rings, you read the Silmarillion and all of the other and like you just, it didn't feel like I could ever do enough. I just wanted to read a good story. And so for a long time I like avoided fantasy because I felt really alienated by that kind of gatekeeping of who gets to call themselves a fan of something. So when I set out to write Shades of Magic, I like specifically was thinking about that version of myself. And so I, instead of writing multiple worlds, it was like one world, 4 ways, each one with a philosophical relationship to magic. I like found ways to undermine these fantasy elements that I had felt kind of off-putting by. And so I wanted, there is language, there is like fictional language, but it's the spice and not the meal. And you don't have to read it. You can skim it if you like, or you can learn it if you like. They're both valid directions. And I wanted to take everything back to the most accessible place possible. Because for me, I think just as a practical author, every step that we ask the reader to take away from reality is a step we lose somebody. And, you know, I didn't want to take 50 steps from reality. I wanted to make sure 1 foot was always there in reality. And that meant that making my magical systems as intuitive and intrinsic as possible. That meant nothing is arbitrary and we can understand, we can wrap our head around it. I never wanted to lose somebody because the system became too complicated for them. To me, that's such a stupid way to lose a reader. Like by like excluding them by making something feel too inaccessible. And so at the end of the day, like, yes, I want to write fantasy, or I want to write sci-fi, or I want to write some genre. I just want it to be fun. I want you to forget that you're reading. I want you to fall in. And I think anything that pulls you out of the narrative because it's asking too much of you, because it's not intuitive. And so I think taking things back to like really nature-based systems, making sure that like as complicated as things get, they start in a really organic way. Like here's 4 worlds. Think of them like 4 books set side by side. Here's the source of magic on one end, so it doesn't reach all the way. You know, here's ways to think of it that are very natural and very intuitive. And then over the course of the books, we can build and we can add magical elements, but you'll be able to hold on to them and follow them because you have a really strong foundation.
The comments that are coming in, very appreciative of it. Black Belt saying, I love the magic system in Shades of Magic. B-Rock Vandal saying, Darker Shades is one of my favorite magic systems. So I do think that it's a real testament. And you're right. Like when we kind of explored fantasy when we were younger, it was often written by the same type of man. You know, and I think that was like they had to one up each other, and it became sort of like, you know, too far removed from that grounded thing. But I will say, you know, it was white guys that wrote Avatar: The Last Airbender, and like, holy hell, like that show.
They can do it.
Yeah.
They can do it. Also think that like sometimes with fantasy, it's really telling who's writing it, because if you design a fantasy that looks exactly like has the exact same power dynamics that our world already has, what that says is you already see yourself at the center of the story.
Mm.
So my stories tend to be like aggressively more queer. They tend to be aggressively less white. They tend to like take characters who are often fringe characters in those traditional white male straight narratives, and they take them out of the periphery and they give them center stage, because I like normalize a lot of things, because to me like that's my fantasy. My fantasy is like you getting to love who you want to love. And of course you have to shift a power dynamic. So instead of the power dynamic being on your identity or your sexual orientation, it's literal power.
Mm.
It's who has more magic. And by shifting it onto who has more magic, we shift it away from other things, like other things of race and of class and of sexuality, so that those can, because like to me as a reader, I want to read normalcy. Like I want to read something that isn't like, I don't want the only reason I get to take up space on the page to be because of one facet of my identity. I
Yeah.
don't want to be a token,
And I think that
so
lived experience will absolutely help with that. And I think that the notion of showing and not telling, that's
yes,
the number one way, where it's just like, it's not this, it's just
exactly.
we're living because this is what life actually is. And it's, you know,
Yeah.
it's an everyday slice. So I absolutely appreciate that.